key role in influencing the socio-economic and the political eras of the 1950s and the 1960s. Right? So the efforts of the civil rights movements, which chiefly are those efforts of going down or taking place in the third period. But they come to a culmination, if you will, in the late 1960s, which then transitions into something more militant, or the Black Power movement. But the efforts of the civil rights movement definitely played a key role in influencing the socio-economic and the political policies of the 1950s and the 1960s. Although there was a real presence of poverty and crime throughout the period in the black community, economic and educational opportunities were clearly more available, particularly beginning in the fourth period, than they had ever been before for black people. Specifically, the late 1950s and the 1960s would prove to be a period of substantial economic gain. Social programs and or research on the conditions of low-income blacks received unprecedented support. So to be a researcher at that time in the 1950s, and 1960s in particular, at the opening of the fourth period was a hot time to be if you wanted to study those ghetto issues, if you wanted to study those street issues or those black male issues. The federal government was coughing up a lot of money, particularly under the presidencies of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Jimmy Carter. All right? They played a real role in rerouting opportunity in this country. Not that they were all great people, but they did do better than most who came before them. I will say that. I will say that. Right? So in 1964, or let me back up, particularly more specifically, the Kennedy, the Johnson, the Carter presidential administrations really were influential. Johnson was absolutely committed to the social concerns of those U.S. citizens who were economically impoverished. He banked his entire presidency on it. Although he was really good friends with J. Edgar Hoover, right? So what is that all about? And he really didn't get along with John F. Kennedy, former vice president of JFK. Takes over as president because of the assassination in 1963. But even though he was probably not black people's best friend at all, he still wanted to be known as that. And he worked really hard to create an image, you know, and he definitely wanted his image to be better than JFK in terms of serving the interests of poor people and black people. These men's efforts gave birth to what was called the Great Society. This was a formal program by the federal government. And more specifically, the Great Society was interested in such objectives, if you will, as the war on poverty, which was big then. This is what they called it. I have a book called The War on Poverty from this year. Affirmative action comes about in 1965, I believe. All right. The new black middle class. It's the first stable black middle classes, you know, ever, right? 80% of all black folk up until this point in American history are all poor, working class, blue-collar workers at best. Now we have the first in 1965, the first stable black middle class. And then 80% of all black PhDs also come after 1965. So affirmative action is doing some stuff. We've got ABC programs out there, we've got Head Start. All that is starting in 1965. All of it. You know, for the most part, not all of it. I'm not lying too much. And the most infamous report, if you will, infamous, hopefully that's a good word, but the most infamous report on black men is the Moynihan report by Dr. or is he a doctor? But definitely Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He may be a doctor. I think he's still alive.
What is it?
The Moynihan.
Like what you said is the first black report of black men.
I'm gonna get into it. 2 seconds. I'm gonna get into it. Okay? Hold on, let me just back up for a second. So, the Great Society produced these things, this interestingly enough, this new opportunity, if you will, particularly as it relates to black people. Interestingly enough, this new opportunity, as opposed to simply creating opportunity for black folk, this also deepened this created a socio-economic splitting, if you will, of the community. And what happened is we began to see for the first time clearer haves and have-nots in the black community. That's what happened in 1965. right? So if you read Swaggernath and Domhouse books, Blacks in the White Establishment, who's founding the ABC program since the 60s until the 1980s, right? These are two white Jews writing this book. Excellent read, get it if you can. That's the argument that they made. All an ABC program or a Head Start program or affirmative action ever did was split the black community. Right? So you had a federal government that came in and just said, okay, since y'all creating all this ruckus across this country, we're just going to allow some to benefit a little bit more. We're going to create the impression as if they did it all by themselves so they can feel good about themselves, and we're going to leave the base of black people out. What happens is the infighting creates or generates in a way that we've never seen in black America. There was always tension between the have and have-nots in the black community, but now it's real. It's real in a way that we haven't seen before. Yeah.
Oh, just a brief note. I remember reading the book on Michael's autobiography. It's a really good read. It's a really long read. It's like 700 plus pages. He's one hell of a storyteller though. And he went to Howard University for his undergraduate in the early part of the 60s, late part of the 50s, early part of the 60s. And he makes a point of saying the reputation of Howard University has now about we had bougie black folks, we had the real black folks, and just, he says that didn't start in the 80s or 90s. That was going on back in the 50s and 60s. You had the upper middle class black people coming there and having a certain aura of entitlement, if you will, because of the work that their parents did. And they really clashed with the more lower working class black folks that were able to get to Howard because their parents or their family didn't do the same sorts of work. So it was interesting to me, at least, to note, even as early as that late 50s, early 60s part, before we even get into the mid to later 60s, there was still that sort of tension going on. Right? You had more obvious class divisions among the black community.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the class tension in the black community begins then. Really quickly, Moynihan Report, what is it? Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in 1965 was commissioned to write a report on the state of black men in the country at that time. A lot of the positions that we've been talking about on class had some respects come to a head, and they really wanted to have another federal report since the Kerner report, right? The report that we reviewed. That's a report that predates this one, I believe. I could be getting that wrong. But in any event, they wanted a new, polished report. Now, interestingly enough, this is still a very controversial report today. Very controversial report today. We kind of stepped in some hot water. Right? The report in general is essentially about the black family, or fatherless homes. Right? And for him, for Moynihan, a good writer, good thinker, good researcher, that gave him the platform to talk about all of the issues that he wanted to talk about in the black community. He's liberal. He was trying to hold it down for black people, particularly for poor black people. This is not a guy that was trying to levy an argument to hurt the black community. Although particularly black scholars or the black intelligentsia or black middle class would interpret his report as doing that. But that is not what he was doing genuinely. Not to say they're making mistakes. But he was trying to frame the black community in a way that could receive even more support. He was a child of the Great Society. Right? All right. What happens is this. He ultimately blames black women in the report for being the problem. Interestingly enough, right? It's the first time we ever begin to see scholars of his status do something like that. That doesn't happen amongst scholars. For the most part, white, black, liberal, conservative, 9 times out of 10, a person in my position are going to frame black men as the issue or the problem for the black community. But here you have for the first time, particularly a white male liberal, saying, nah, black women, the treatment of their men, they're running them out of their homes, so on and so on. Some of this stuff I disagree with, but some of this stuff, I thought he was being a scientist about it. I think his biggest issue was this, though. It wasn't his claims against black women, more than it was his entitlement or his comfortability, if you will, with regard to talking about black issues. His report was real. He kept it real. He talked about real issues. He talked about it in a way he didn't hide, he didn't dismiss some of the struggles or the hardships of the community. But at the end of the day, and this is what we all need to know in the room, when we're talking about black men and treated in the criminal justice system or any marginalized population, there are parts of that story that is just for them to tell. You can't, even if you do know the story, even if you can make logical sense out of it, even if you do understand what's going on, there's some things you just can't say. There's some things that, I mean, so it's bigger than, you know, the word nigger, you know, so we can say you can't, it's bigger than that. There are other narratives that are going on in these communities, other stories that are going on in these communities, other interpretations, other levels or forms of analysis that are also concurrently going on in this community that is not for you to say. And that was his mistake. He got too comfortable. He's almost framing issues as if he was a black person who lived in this community at this time, where he should have framed it and it would have been okay as a white man who was deeply interested in poor black issues. And that would have been recognized or seen as more of a sign of respect, right? So